Welcome to Raise the Line with Osmosis from Elsevier, seeking solutions with leading experts on how to increase healthcare capacity so people can get the care they need during the pandemic and beyond.
Hi, I'm Shivani. We've had some fascinating conversations on Raise Line on a wide range of issues related to women's health, including menopause, fertility, birth control, incontinence, and others. But today's conversation might be the most, shall we say, stimulating of all. I'm delighted to welcome Anna Lee, who's the co-founder and head of engineering at Lioness, a woman-led sexual wellness company that built the world's only smart vibrator that improves understanding of sexual pleasure and orgasms through biofeedback data and science. Lioness also has a broader mission to expand understanding and research in sexual health and to destigmatize female sexuality. Anna was previously a mechanical engineer at Amazon, launching the Amazon Dash button's original concept and the Kindle Voyage page press technology. She's been named to the Forbes 30 under 30 list, which is how we met at a conference in Israel and Detroit after that, and has been covered in numerous national publications for her groundbreaking work. She's also a prominent creator or anti-influencer on TikTok with nearly 400,000 followers. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. This is very exciting to kind of talk about the nerdier side of it all.
Totally. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's definitely a concept that ever since I saw what you were working on at the Forbes conference, I was like, our audience has to learn about this because it's one of those things that isn't talked about enough and it affects, half the population directly.
Totally.
So before we get into that, tell us a bit more about yourself. You have a really interesting background. You became an engineer, you trained at Berkeley, but what got you into the space?
Yeah, it's a good question. Honestly, I grew up in Korea till I was about 8 and then moved to the US, and my parents immigrated with the idea of the American dream. And I grew up in a actually extremely conservative and religious family where we never talked about sex. So I always have to tell people, me doing this now, where I can talk about in interviews or, talk about our company, this is all kind of a 7-year journey for me as well, because I was scared of my own body to my mid-20s. And so I never thought I would be an entrepreneur, one, and also especially in the sex toy industry. But it's one of those kind of beautiful life moments where I was at Amazon, and as much as I loved it, I just realized that there's a superpower in being a engineer with being a woman and having a perspective of how we design products or how do we build products that actually cater to serving the population you're building for, and realizing how male dominated the sex toy industry was. And then as we kind of started looking deeper into it, seeing what the lack of research there is on female sexual function. And so it just felt like a nice combination of things that came together of being oh, we need to build something that actually furthers the industry and also just bring out be able to destigmatize the taboo around female sexuality.
Totally. And I think, you kind of grew up over the past decade, Lioness has grown up in that there's been so many medical devices that have become consumerized, right? So we've talked about in previous meetings about smartphone-based electrocardiograms, smartphone-based electroencephalograms. And I'd love to hear more about kind of, how that trend has been. And you guys are the first, I believe, and maybe the only smart vibrator. And I think you have the largest data set too of sexual pleasure in women. So can you talk a bit about some of that?
Yeah. So actually, when we originally started the company, we came in with the idea that we wanted to make an AI vibrator, that it was going to vibrate and move the more you got to learn about you and the data. And so one of the things we had to do was starting to look at the sex research around sexual function. How do we even measure what an orgasm looks like? What does arousal look like? How does research quantify that? And one of the things we realized is there's very, very, very little papers on it. And so the first paper that's still probably one of the most well cited is from led by Bolin in 1982, and it was a sample size, I believe, of 8 women or something in the sub 20 women. And then so he is charting out pelvic floor contractions as the orgasm, which is a really, really great starting point. But it's wild that we don't have any more research really that's kind of charting those things out. And so I think when we started, it's interesting to come into the consumer side of one, kind of battling the stigma of everything, but then also the term sex tech wasn't actually coined as a term yet when we first started the company. And so it was a constant battle between people seeing us as a pornographic company, I think investors and banks even seeing it as pornographic, not wanting to touch it, the space, but then also bringing in all this biofeedback data and knowing that we can kind of track pelvic floor contractions and then kind of pitching it back to researchers and medical researchers and academic researchers. And they're also a little nervous to touch sex toys. So it kind of started out definitely on a kind of a belief that we just felt so passionate that we track everything else in our lives in terms of biofeedback on your sleep, your health, like all these aspects, but why we're not doing it for sex, especially for women. So it really was like a blind faith. And I think sometimes I'm like, wow, maybe we are starting a little bit too early because like now it's great that there's a term sex tech and there's an industry and there's numbers behind that industry. But definitely when we started, I think it was such a novel concept that it really was like, and like smart things were kind of talked about as like, are too many things getting smart? Like, and what purpose? And so it was really like fighting for our space there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They're often these innovations, and then there's this hype cycle around them. But as a first mover, you're basically helping create the category. I remember even for Osmosis, in other fields of education, there were terms like flipped classroom and active versus passive learning, but not in
Mm,
health, not in medical school, not in medical education as much. And so it was very lonely in the beginning. And if you're able to survive long enough, there's a guy we had on the podcast named Burke Smith who said this great thing, which is if you're able to stick around long enough, your timing is perfect. And so
mm.
it it does feel like your timing is really good now, at least from the outside in, where obviously your TikTok growth's been great. I don't know much about kind of the product and the sales and stuff, but we're going to get into some of that. That there has been a lot of interest in women's health, and
Yeah.
some of the investors and people are recognizing that half the world is women, and and we need to pay attention to issues that ranging from again menopause to contraception and things like that could all be improved. So tell us a bit about kind of the actual product and like how it works, about the data sets you're collecting, and what kind of work you're doing with with that data.
Yeah, so we have a rabbit style vibrator. So it's part of it is inserted vaginally or anally, and then there's a little nub that's like the clitoral nub that vibrates. So it looks just like a rabbit style vibrator, but what we've changed is basically we've put in force sensors that are measuring your pelvic floor contractions, your involuntary pelvic floor contractions, which is one of the best indicators for arousal and orgasms. So when we like define what an orgasm is, we're looking at rhythmic pelvic floor contractions. There are other physiological things that happen, like increase in heart rate, your breath, your perspiration, pupils dilate. So there are all different types of things that people usually track in research, but pelvic floor contractions is one of the, I would say, easiest barriers to it, but also just a very recognizable pattern that happens. So you would use the vibrator just like a normal vibrator, and then you can pair it to your phone. And what you're getting is the biofeedback data that you've collected in terms of the involuntary pelvic floor contractions. So we always tell people, like, what if I have a penis? Like, can I still use the product? I'm always like, everybody has pelvic floor muscles. So whether you insert it anally or vaginally, it completely works the same. You'll still get the same data. So what we've been doing now is we partner and we try to look. So currently we have the world's largest data set on female physiological sexual function, which is really amazing. And it feels like a big responsibility of us being like, okay, so what can we learn from this? So our hypothesis was always that in terms of like for people with penises and cis men, when they go into the doctor's office for erectile dysfunction, the first thing they're checking for, especially in your like when you're early, like younger ages, they're checking for cardiovascular disease because they know there's a correlation between erectile dysfunction, cardiovascular disease, and there's different things you can know from sexual function. But for women, we don't really have that. And there's different papers that'll quote anything from like 30 to 80% of women experience female sexual dysfunction at some point in their life. And I think it's, the common thing we hear in movies and things, or, the funny joke of like, women are so complicated. We don't understand women. We don't understand how they work, why they don't have orgasms, all of that. And I think for us, we just know that it's just because one, we don't know enough. And so some of the really cool things we've been able to see with our data is one, just the patterns that happen. So being able to collect exactly what patterns we're looking at, what changes them. So different external factors, whether it's things like caffeine, alcohol, what those things have changes on the data side of the pelvic floor contractions, but then also actually seeing just general pelvic floor function, being able to see like how they're contracting. So say they have like any sort of pelvic floor dysfunction, seeing kind of what the baseline is. Does vibration actually change that pelvic floor contraction or the strength of those muscles? And I know there's recently some I think Mount Sinai is working on like how vibrations can actually have can help with urinary incontinence. So it kind of starts going into this big field of, well, what can vibrators do for people and how do we actually track those measurements of success or changes in body. And so my favorite thing I always tell people is we had a athlete who's been a really long time user of the Lioness, and she came back and she was like, hey, something's wrong, like the data is looking really odd, it's like flatlined, and I think maybe the vibrator is broken. And so we were kind of like going through, she sent it in, we're like looking at diagnosing, we're trying to look at the software, firmware, hardware, we couldn't find anything wrong with it. And then we're looking at her data and she's like, we're like, dude, did something happen on this date when the data started looking weird? And she's like, oh yeah, she's like, I had a sports injury, she's like, I had a concussion. And then I just remember all of us just sitting there being like, I think the data is from maybe the concussion flatlining your orgasms and not that the vibrator itself is like something's wrong with the sensors. And so that was something we got to kind of look at deeper as like a potential case study of like, like traumatic brain injuries, what that has in terms of an effect on your orgasms or vice versa. So we always say, like, I think what we're doing is we're finding that orgasms are the canary in the coal mine for healthcare implications and like what that means for the rest of your overall health.
That is fascinating. Like, I love that analogy to obviously the circulatory health in men, and obviously erectile dysfunction is something that's been studied for decades because
With
men.
so much funding and research, it's wild.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, but again, that hopefully, and we can talk about that. Are you seeing that change? Like, are you seeing a lot more interest now in women's health and the work you're doing, like, because of that? Because because
Yeah.
of everything's been unleashed, or no?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a growth. I know for a fact, like women's health is definitely understood as a really underserved and under-researched portion, right? Like even if we're looking at clinical drug trials and what gender of animal they're using, a lot of times previously it was always like male, like for example, male mice versus using female mice as well. So I think just overall health in general, we're seeing a huge trend, and now there's funding and focus to make sure we understand women's health overall. I would say sexual function, especially when it comes to things like pleasure and arousal, is still, I would say, like it's still a privileged topic in terms of like it's not the core of like what's important to every person, and I think not seen as still overall health and overall wellness. And so I would say there's still a huge stigma and taboo in this space specifically. So when we say like women's sexual health, when there is funding in that space, a lot of times it'll focus more on fertility, pelvic floor function, but when we kind of bring in sexual pleasure, it gets a little bit still a little taboo. But I think we're just it's in the waves of it changing over time, but definitely still a challenge now.
Yeah, and that's again one of the main reasons we're having you on, because we want to expose our audience to it, because they're the ones who are going to be providers who have a lot of
Yes.
authority and respect, and if they can have those open conversations with their parents, with their patients, like for example,
And
it's like
parents.
and parents, yeah, exactly, and they're say somebody becomes a psychiatrist, a couples counselor, like clearly sex is one of the core things there, and maybe the work you're doing, the data that people are using from your company could be used to hopefully elucidate things psychiatrically, mental health wise, even what you mentioned here with maybe concussions and how that relates to just normal physiological function. I will say the other piece that this reminds me of is another guest we had on the podcast is Rick Doblin, who since the 1980s has been working to legalize MDMA for various mental health conditions, but also just in general. And he made this point too, that like really they're focused on PTSD first. They've done two very successful phase 3 clinical trials on combat veterans and people who've experienced sexual assault, like rapes and whatnot, and they have found that about 2/3 of the patients with severe PTSD after therapy that was augmented with MDMA are now symptom free of PTSD. And some of these people had PTSD for 5, 10, 15 years. And he made the point that it was easy for people, for Congress, for researchers, for NIH funders to get behind, let's treat combat veterans and victims of rape for PTSD using these psychedelics. So how do you get somebody from like, a pathological condition to normal? The analogy here is like incontinence, which I know a lot about because I'm not personally, but my mom is a physical therapist who's been treating incontinence for decades. Biofeedback, pelvic floor therapy, Kegels, those kind of things. How do you get people from like, incontinent to continent? And the next wave, though, and what Rick Doblin and others want to do in the psychedelic space is how do you take somebody who's like normal or average and get them to flourish, get them to thrive. And your data set obviously can be used, and device can be used for the research from abnormal to normal. But also, I think it's a worthy goal for people to focus on the things that help people thrive and flourish. So whether psychedelics, sex tech, these previously taboo subjects, I think are extremely important for us to all invest in and work on, which is again one reason I'm so excited about what you're working on. So tell us a bit about, you have the core product, you have the core data set. Like what are your main kind of goals this year that you can share? Or do you have any other products in development or research studies that you want to talk about? And then where do you see the company in like 5 years?
That's a good question. So I think for us, one of the big things is that we kind of teeter on a really interesting, we toe the line between being an e-commerce product where we're very consumer facing, and then also doing the work behind like empowering researchers to be able to do different studies and understanding. So I think for us last year, one really exciting thing that happened was an abstract led by Dr. Jim Faust was published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine that was using the Lioness vibrators with 58 participants, and then seeing it was a validation study of like, does the Lioness vibrator enable getting the same biofeedback pelvic floor contraction data that you would get at a lab facility, where you go into this lab, you get this device. It's like a photoplasmograph that you insert vaginally, and then you're basically sitting in this lab trying to have an orgasm so you can collect this data. And so they get that same exact data? And so it was a small study, but the validation of, that in the 58 people, they're able to identify that orgasm in the same way. So one of the things that makes us excited is like, now we're opening it up into this concept of like, this is stuff that's like in your home, in real time, in your daily use of life, like how that data looks, right? Like versus you having to go into the lab. And I think it also enables a larger group of people that is better representative than people who have the ability to go into a lab or live near a facility that can do that. And so I think for us now, it's really focusing on figuring out how to get these researchers to get funded and then have these understandings of studies on continuing with like pelvic floor contractions. What do we know about orgasms? What do we know that could change, and what factors will change it? So I think this year, that's like our big focus, is to continue just doing more research with the data and having researchers who are interested in empowering them to be able to use the Lioness and then the data around it to kind of get more information and research out there. So I think for us, the mission has always been to destigmatize female sexual pleasure and through science and research. And so being able to continue to do that for our brand, and obviously with the component of we are still consumer facing at the end of the day. And so we're always trying to continue to sell more products. And then I think the next big thing for us is that we know that a rabbit style vibrator can be limiting. It doesn't fit for all body types or all form factors. Some people have different preferences. We've definitely gotten feedback of people want to be able to use it in like, especially like in heterosexual sex, like paired sex relationships. And so how do you use something that is inserted but also get the data at the same time? And so it's continuing to build out products that can actually be more of a measurement tool, and then also working with researchers on the question of like, well, if there was a measurement tool where you can actually get as much information like vaginal dryness, like what does that actually look like, and all of these different things, like how can we help build those things out for you to help build a better understanding, more platforms for data, and all of that. So it's always an interesting challenge. I would say like this year, it's just honing in on the data that we currently have and being like, what can we tell people about the data? We know that right now, what we've seen is that there's unique patterns of orgasms. So everyone almost has like a unique identifier. So for example, like my orgasm rhythmic pattern data will look different from my co-founders, right? And like being able to distinguish the two. And so we've almost seen like some people have different patterns, because I would say historically we've only seen what has been defined as an orgasm is like a rhythmic squeeze and relax of data, but we've seen some people have what we call the volcano type, which is like a huge explosion of force and then a huge drop down, not much of a rhythmic contraction, and then some that we call an avalanche, where it starts much higher in force and has the squeeze and relax, but it goes down in force over time. So it's interesting to see that we're seeing other patterns where people are like, no, this is still an orgasm. And so kind of bringing it into the research world of, well, maybe we need to increase what the definition of an orgasm, what that looks like. Because it's actually a pretty hotly debated topic, I would say, on like what the definition of an orgasm is. So I would say this year it's like focusing on the data that we have and seeing what we can continue to learn and expand from. How do we get people to learn more things about their body? But I would say in the 5 years, it's continuing to actually, I think one thing we know how to do, and my bread and butter is to build products and understand exactly how to manufacture something or integrate sensors and then get it out into mass production. And so using kind of our skill sets and then with our passion for destigmatizing female sexual wellness and continuing to help researchers and doctors really be able to do that in their fields.
That's so fascinating and really top of mind for me right now, because literally, I mean, we talked, this, and we talked about this right before the podcast started. I'm back in Baltimore restarting medical school, my third year of med school, using Osmosis. And so we've been relearning ECGs, and I just watched the entire electrocardiogram ECG series. And this is, as you probably know, over 100-year-old technology. And the amount of stuff you can tell about the heart and how it functions based on a 12-lead ECG, it's remarkable, right? Like in terms of deviation, in terms of bundle blocks, in terms of has somebody had an infarct or ischemia in the past. And similarly, the work that you're doing, the signals you're getting, the data set you're getting in, for more diverse and inclusive set of people than the people, as you said, the 8 people who could go into a lab and like somehow have an orgasm in a lab setting, versus more natural settings and many more people, is why I think it's so exciting.
I know, the whole thing about the lab thing, there's another one. There's a Rutgers University, led by Dr. Barry Komisaruk. They do like a fMRI brain scan during an orgasm to see like how your brain is, like what lights up and all of that. And I love the concept. It's so cool, but it's so funny if you ever like Google image the photos. Like they're wearing like this Hannibal Lecter style mask, and they're basically going into this fMRI, and you can't bring a vibrator. It has to be so they have to train to only use manual stimulation with your hand, or you're able to bring your partner. But the whole thing is you can't move your head the whole time. You're hearing these like clicking sounds, and I was just like, it's just so cool, and also just wild to think that's like the things we have to do to understand anything about sex.
That's remarkable. That's so fun. I want to see those images later of how they did that. That's crazy. So yeah, okay. Well, so product development, data sets, more research. By the way, on the research side, obviously Osmosis is now part of Elsevier. Elsevier is one of the largest publisher of health and scientific research, and we're just launching a rare disease journal soon. So they keep launching journals. And I'm curious, something we can follow up on is like, Science Direct, are there, like, could you immediately find all these researchers who at some point publish something about pelvic floor biofeedback and for sexual wellness? It could be a cool thing to explore.
That'd be really cool. Yeah, the pelvic floor stuff I think is such a great entrance point. I think, as you're saying, is like if it does, like if vibrations, we know that can help urinary incontinence, or the baseline of pelvic floor muscle strength, like before there's vibration to after an orgasm, they're seeing like there's a drop in pelvic floor contraction, the baseline of how strong or how tight the vaginal muscles are. And so there's some really cool things there that I think anecdotally, I've heard so many great things from PTs and pelvic floor therapists and doctors. And so now it's kind of bringing it all together of like, what if we can just get a handful of data and just seeing if there's anything there and then just continuing from that.
Totally. That was super exciting. Switching gears real quick, you mentioned this term anti-influencer and your incredible growth on TikTok and I'm sure other platforms. So you are an educator at heart, like you're educating hundreds of thousands of actually millions of people, because only a subset of people who probably watch a video will subscribe, if it's anything like Osmosis videos, about these common topics. What are some of so tell us a bit about that journey, what got you into it, kind of what content people are asking for. I know you answer a lot of these common questions. So again, I'm looking at this from a frame of like people listening to this are going to be our current or will be future primary care doctors or nurses. They have whether it's a 15-year-old coming into their clinic or a 50-year-old, and asking them these questions. You're the one who's answering tons of these in like a native format of TikTok and probably other things. What are some of the questions that you're getting asked? And like, again, tell us about the content trajectory.
Yeah, I would say, and I think maybe this is right for your audience, is I actually never meant to do TikTok. I define myself, I'm definitely a millennial in the sense of like, I don't understand Gen Z humor half the time. When TikTok first came out, I was like, this is an unhinged platform, not for me. The one thing I know, and I tell this advice to anyone, and especially brands or companies or, people building personal brands on like, how do we use social media as a platform to like, how do we grow on this platform? And I think one of the things I tell all people, like, we just have to accept that we're in an older space. We're not funny, we're not trendy, like, not, we shouldn't be following any of those things. But the one thing I think we can offer is like whatever we've learned in our lifetime so far, and like give, because what people want to do is like they want to leave with knowing something else. And so for me, it became like my friends just pinging me all the time of like, hey, I have a sex question. Like, what happens if you like, X, Y, and Z? Or even at a bar, if someone knows what I do for a living, they'll be like, okay, can I ask you like 10 questions on sex advice and stuff like that? And so I realized it was a shame the amount that I'm sitting around reading sex research papers, like what's the latest thing, like what's the next sex research that's coming out, but not actually sharing that information because not everyone is going to sit around and read sex research papers like I do. And so it really just became a thing where I was like, okay, I need to use this platform to, I think, just tell people things I've learned about sex. And I did it on a whim. I mainly did it for my friends so that they can have something there. I'm like, oh, can you explain like female ejaculation? Like, what actually is that? Like, all of these things. And just from what I know of it. And then it just became a thing where people were so curious and just have so many questions. And I think the questions, and it's the same reason why we even built this company, and it's the same questions we get now. And how I know that we have so much work left to do is the question is, am I normal? Right? Like, hey, this thing happens during sex, or like I don't feel like aroused, or I'm not, my sex drive has changed, or I'm on antidepressants and it's really changed my sex drive, or I'm experiencing like post pregnancy, like a difference in like, sexual function is different. My pelvic floor muscles, like orgasms aren't strong enough. And the question is like, am I normal? Is this a normal experience that everyone else experiences? And I think a lot of times when we go to, including myself, a lot of times when you go to a doctor is not particularly equipped to tell you anything about sexual function in terms of like pleasure and orgasms, unless you happen to have a great doctor who's open and like willing to kind of have those conversations with you and just what's kind of out there in terms of knowledge. And so you're kind of left alone to be just not even know anything, any information, or wondering, and you're left to Google, and Google's not going to, it's a battle of SEO. And so I think it just made people feel maybe comfortable. Like, I always have to preface, like, I'm not a doctor, I'm never giving medical advice, I'm really just telling like what I know so far, or what's out there in current research, what sex educators would tell you. And so I think the balance of just being able to give people even simple things, I think, has been really cool to see people feeling like they have a place where they can ask a question, or they can learn something that is hard to be answered. Because I've definitely had the times where I'm at my OBGYN and I'm like, hey, like this happens, like, do you think that's normal? And it's hard when it's always chalked up to like, oh, it might be your birth control, or like your hormones, or everybody's body is different. And then you're like, but like, why? And so I think it's fun to do that. And it's also just the fun side of, no one's ever really seen what orgasm data looks like. And so being able to show that has definitely been like a cool experience for people, I think, to like take that and being like, oh, like that's cool that someone's even doing something in this space.
That's awesome and super cool because, again, just from like the core biofeedback data you're getting is itself valuable and interesting, but even like the engagement you're getting, the comments, the questions, is also very interesting, because these are things that maybe people aren't bringing up, or maybe they are, but not at the scale and volume that you have, to their primary care docs, their nurses, their OBGYNs. And so I think in this, if COVID has taught us anything, and one of the reasons Osmosis does what it does, is the importance of education and helping people better understand their bodies and take more control, because the more they understand their bodies, the more engaged they become generally with their own health. And then
Yeah.
the more, the more engaged the patient is, the better generally. I mean, sure, you get the hypochondriacs. I would much rather have somebody who takes so much care and attention for their health than someone who's totally disengaged and they show up in, at 70 having smoked for 56 years and, lung cancer stage 4. It's much better to have the reverse problem, I think.
Totally, totally. And I think, yeah, and it definitely, like, before I would say I was actually not even like a biohacker for myself. Like, I don't know, half the time, like, I don't know, like it could be this. And I rarely went to doctors for checkups, but there is something very powerful about knowing about your own body, because who else knows it more on your daily day-to-day function of like what's changed, what makes it feel different. And so as much as I advocated for sexual wellness and sexual health, I'm like, dang, yeah, you should definitely do that for the rest of your body, because no one else is going to advocate as hard as you will.
Totally. That's a great message. I know we're coming up on time, so I did have just a couple quick questions for you to wrap this up. The first is, obviously Osmosis is a teaching company. We have courses on ECG, on medical procedures, and, endocrine disorders, etc. If you could snap your fingers and teach a course on something, or a video or a course on anything to any audience, what would it be and why? Granted, I know you're already doing this, but say you wanted Osmosis to create something, what would it be and why?
God, I really would just be like everything to do with women's health. And I think everything we don't know, learning a little bit about every single thing, especially I think, yeah, I think just sexual pleasure. Like, I think the question of like why there's such a high percentage of female sexual dysfunction, and then what the definition of female sexual dysfunction is, what it's correlated to, and how we actually help people. Because I think right now there's so many supplements and different things out there, but is it really solving the main problem? So yeah, something in that realm. It's all
Totally.
fluid and spongy, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it's all related. And again, I think we're chipping away at it between kind of what you're doing and what we're doing and what hundreds of other great people and companies are doing.
Yeah. So maybe my answer was like anything and everything to do with health.
That's a good answer. I mean, again,
ask?
it's pretty achievable. We'll have that to you in 2 weeks or so.
Okay, perfect. I'm very excited. I'm all for it.
Awesome. Well, 2 last questions. We have a lot of early stage professionals in our audience. Again, many of them going into healthcare careers, but other, digital health, other kind of careers. What advice would you give to them about approaching their careers?
Oh, I think the one advice that I've kept throughout the years, because it always changes, like the more I learn about myself and the world and how I view the world, but I think really the only thing that really carries in life is like how passionate you are about something. The moment you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe this is something interesting, it's never going to carry, because there's going to be so many hard times in your life where things get so hard for your career or life decisions. And I think the one thing that will carry through is how passionate and how mission driven are you about this specific thing? Because that's the stuff, especially let's say like you're starting a company, like I would never wish on anybody unless they're just so wild to be like, this is the thing that I want to do and I'm so passionate about. And that passion is the only thing that's going to truly carry through the hardest times, because otherwise it's going to feel like a slog. So I would say just be very, very, very honest about yourself about what you're passionate about, but also be flexible to know that passions and values can always change or reprioritize. But really just be honest with yourself. Like, what's your number one passion and priority, and how do you fulfill that for yourself?
That's awesome advice. And I would add, build up upon that, if you let me, that
Please.
To find, you probably know Angela Duckworth wrote the book Grit, and in that book, she talks about how do you find your passion, where a lot of people think like, I'm born with a passion. Like suddenly and clearly, like in your case, in my case, like we both have started companies that have done pretty well and reached a lot of people, but it wasn't like we were born like wanting to create Lioness and Osmosis. You try it, you just start trying something, and then like over time that may develop into a passion and may not. When you realize that you're staying up to read literature on female sexuality, or in my case I was reading like articles on how do you learn, how do you forget, like just nobody could pay me to do it, I was just doing it. And so finding your passion, like don't put the cart before the horse, where like once you find the passion, boom. And the second thing is, as far as you're an anti-influencer, and I mentioned like when you want to find like your niche for what content you create in or what career you pursue, doing something that you're so vocally or so interested in doing anyways, like I mentioned, like you were reading sex papers and stuff, you probably would do that for like anyways, just to make, because you're just interested in it. And then nobody can outcompete you at that because nobody's as passionate about that as you. And that comes across when you create content or build a company. And yeah, there'll be hard times. We've discussed this as entrepreneurs, but because of that passion, you're going to go through it, as you said.
Totally, totally. Yeah, it really is like the intersection of skills is what makes you powerful, right? Like there's like if if you play the piano, there's going to be a billion people that are also good at the piano and maybe probably better than you, but it's the intersections that I think make us so interesting. And it is the one thing of like I was so horrified about being an influencer, like a TikToker, but then I was like, oh, but it gives me this power to be able to share the things that I've learned about like this world and what I'm super passionate about. And it's just finding those intersections and being like, oh, I already like love talking to people. So this all just kind of works together. And I already love being really short and sweet and to the point. So it all kind of comes together. So yeah, I think just figuring out the passions between like all the little interdisciplines and all of that.
Totally. My last question, anything else you want to get across to our audience before we let you go?
Oh, not, I don't know. I think it's just really like, I mean, I appreciate you for giving me the platform to even talk about sexual function. I think, especially, I would still say like orgasms and women's sexual pleasure, masturbation is such a taboo topic to this day. Like, I think, especially, people always are surprised when I say like the US has how always been the most interesting place to have built the company. I think it's one of the hardest places to have built the company. There's so much taboo and red tape that's constantly being around for censorship and all of that. So I think it's just being able to give people the seed of like, hey, what if we look at orgasms or sexual pleasure beyond just it feels good? Like, what if there is something measurable or like the overall health implications to it? I think it's just cool to leave people with that and being like, oh, like the next time you have an orgasm of like feeling like, oh, what does that mean? Or like, how did that feel? And kind of giving yourself the time to reflect on it, I think it's kind of cool. Like, it's a cool new way to think about pleasure.
I agree 100%. I think the next wave we're going to see, especially with AI, psychedelics, all these things coming out, is
Totally.
human flourishing. Like I think that's like going to be the core term in like the 2030s or 2040s. And clearly what you're doing is helping lay the foundation for a lot of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited. But yeah, I think thank you so much for having me. This is like cool to be able to be on something that's like more like in the health space and all of that and education. Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link out to Lioness and your LinkedIn stuff so
Please,
people
yeah.
can contact you. Hopefully some of the people listening will dedicate their careers to research in this stuff. Maybe
Yes,
even reach
we
out.
need more people in this space. So please, like, please come. It's a really cool, it's a really, really interesting space, and you learn so many funny things, and you always have a funny story out of it. So it's a good place to be.
100%. Well, again, Anna, thanks for taking the time to be with us, and more importantly, for the work that you've done, I think, to destigmatize and shed light on and understanding on female sexual health.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And with that, I'm Shiv Gilani. Thank you to our audience for checking out today's show. And remember to do your part to raise the line and strengthen our healthcare system. We're all in this together. Take care.
If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes at osmosis.org/raisethelinepodcast.